Dear Mr. Kilmer. Questions and answers. Question 1. It is important to have a person you look up to in your life. From the novel that you have read, write about one character that you look up to. Give reasons why you choose him or her. Format. Identify the character Richard. Write 3 reasons, positive characteristics or traits. For each trait, give an evidence. Paragraph 1, Introduction. The novel that I read was Dear Mr. Kilmer by Anne Schraff. One character that I looked up to is Richard. There are 3 reasons why I looked up to Richard. Content 1, Trait 1 and Evidence 1. Firstly, he loved animals. This was shown during a hunting trip when Richard purposely missed shooting a buck. Richard thought that hunting was not important. Richard could not kill animals. Gus, Richard's elder brother, was upset with Richard because Richard purposely misfired. Richard's father, Pa, was also disappointed with Richard. Pa asked Richard why he purposely missed shooting the buck. Richard told Pa that he had no right to kill it. Richard told Pa that he felt painful and sad to kill an animal. Pa told Richard not to go hunting anymore if he did not like it. Content 2, Trait 2 and Evidence 2. Secondly, Richard was kind. One day, Mrs. Hansen asked her class to sign a card for the Schirmers. Someone vandalized the tavern owned by Hannah's parents. They painted dirty Huns all over the walls. Mrs. Hansen brought a card to express regret for what had happened. The troublemakers like Abner, Harry, Blanche, and Peggy refused to sign the card. They warned other classmates not to sign the card. The boys were afraid Abner and Harry would hit them. The girls worried that popular girls like Peggy and Blanche would not speak to them. However, Richard was the only student who signed the sympathy card for Hannah Schirmer. After school, Richard took the card from Mrs. Hansen. He wanted to give the card to Hannah. Hannah accepted the card reluctantly. Later, Hannah apologized to Richard for being rude. This was the beginning of their friendship. Content 3, Trait 3 and Evidence 3. In addition, Richard was brave. This was shown when Richard told his family and Mrs. Hansen that he wrote poetry. Before telling his secret to his family and Mrs. Hansen, Richard wrote a letter to Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer was Richard's penpal. Richard learned about Mr. Kilmer when Richard's English teacher, Mrs. Hansen, read a poem to the class. The title of the poem was Trees by Joyce Kilmer. In his letter, Richard told Mr. Kilmer that he wrote poems too. However, he kept this as a secret from everyone. Richard asked for Mr. Kilmer's advice. He wanted to know whether he should tell his secret to everybody. One day, Richard received a letter from Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer advised Richard to overcome his fear. Mr. Kilmer advised Richard to share his poetry with people around him. Nobody was interested when Richard told his family about Mr. Kilmer's letter and his secret. Gus did not believe that Mr. Kilmer was famous. Pa did not believe that Richard wrote poetry. Richard asked whether his family members wanted to read his poems. Nobody was interested. Richard was sad. Gus advised Richard not to tell anyone he wrote poetry. He wanted Richard to fit in with other people. The next day, Richard told Mrs. Hansen that he wrote poetry. He showed her Mr. Kilmer's letter. Mrs. Hansen helped Richard choose a poem to be sent to Mr. Kilmer. As advised by Mrs. Hansen, Richard shared Mr. Kilmer's latest letter and his poem with the class. Some of his classmates, including Blanche and Peggy, were deeply moved by his poem. They started to respect Richard. Last paragraph, Conclusion. In conclusion, I admire and respect Richard because he has good personalities.